Hi everyone and welcome back. Okay, this video is going to be all about pencil strokes. Some of the more common ones that you've seen and some of the ones which I use most of the time. You know, they're my most common pencil strokes that I use to create landscape textures, let's say. Some of them I haven't got names for, some of them I've kind of made up and they're sort of hybrid versions of other pencil strokes, but we'll talk all about that as we get into it. Now I've got an A4 piece of, let's just printer paper actually, I'm going to demonstrate this on, and I'll use a 6B pencil so everything's nice and dark so you can see what's going on. I'll just zoom you in a little bit closer. Right, okay, you should be able to see nice and clear now. Okay, so pencil strokes, well, you've probably all seen the common everyday ones. Well, I say everyday ones, actually these are pencil strokes which I don't actually use. And that's hatching, which is basically that. And then you get cross hatching, which is, again, lines going across the direction of the lines underneath. This is a very common one for artists that are working in ink to use, because this is how they create their various tones, if you like, by doing this technique, because the more you cross hatch those lines in different directions, the darker an area will become. So if I just bring that a bit closer and try and tilt it out of the light, you can see that already, you know, the more I work over this, eventually it's going to become a solid mass. But this is something that I never actually use because I can't find a use for it, particularly in landscapes, other than if I was to try and create a texture or give the impression of a fence or a gate. I'd use hatching like that. You know, if that was a gate and a fence or something, put some hinges on it, post that side, try and get it straight. You know, and this would be the fence there, and we'd have a handle. Just something like that, just something very simple. But generally, other than that, I don't really use hatching or cross hatching in any of my drawings, so we're not going to dwell on that one. Now, one of the pencil strokes I do like to use, which is based around a line, well, they're all based around a line, I guess, but this one is more of a line, you know, like we do with cross hatching, and that's to take that line, it's a simple straight line, but then make it jagged. So we go like this, and you think, well, that's not very impressive, John, what's that all about? Well, we can go off in any direction and we can overlap these to create some fantastic textures, particularly for things like bark textures on trees, wood grain, that kind of thing. And I'll show you what I mean. If I continue on with this and I start to sort of overlap these jagged lines a little bit now, and I take them off in different directions. I don't necessarily have a start point and a stop point. You know, I can start halfway on that line, bring that across, go like that, overlap another one just there. Very similar to drawing tree branches, if you like. You know, they can come off in any direction you like. But if we're drawing bark textures, obviously they need to run in a certain direction. So and you can leave them as spaced out or as close together as you want to. Until they almost become a solid mass in some parts. And you can see just by layering these jagged lines up how this is really starting to resemble something that looks like bark texture. And if we start to shade that, now that's another thing I want to quickly mention as well. A lot of these pencil strokes that I'm going to show you today work best in conjunction with something else, whether it be on top of graphite or whether we actually use this as an underdrawing in its own right and we layer graphite on top, as in this case. If we were to just carefully shade in one side, and just taper that tone a little bit there, and just darken up quite dark along that edge. All of a sudden you'll see that that starts to, you know, it's not brilliant, I mean I'm just kind of scribbling here, but it's starting to resemble bark texture. You know, imagine we've sort of got a little bit of grass or something along the bottom there, and this is a tree, you know, we've got some branches coming off it here and there, you know. And it looks a bit too stark at the minute, but the next thing we can do is just take the blender a little bit and just soften that back. So again, always in conjunction with something else, do these textures and these pencil strokes start to make sense and start to look good. And again, you know, we've got the option of going in with the eraser and creating even more texture, little dots and things like that. So from just that jagged line, a simple jagged line like that, layering it up and going off in different directions, something that just looks like you're doodling and scribbling and it looks like it's going nowhere, you can turn that into something that looks quite convincing for a tree trunk or a tree branch or something like that. And it's the same, if a tree branch was to be going off of the tree in that direction, you can continue these lines on around the corner, making them a little bit thinner, so it looks more natural on the branch there. Obviously that needs filling in with jagged lines, but you can curve these jagged lines round, you know, in any direction you want, so that jagged line can go anywhere you like to create the shape and textures on trees. And again, it doesn't have to be a jagged line, you can make it a little bit more, you know, instead of it having kind of sharp corners and edges and things like that, you can make it a little bit more curved to try and get the impression of different bark textures and wood textures and things like that. You know, smooth them out a little bit, because not all tree textures are like this. You know, some of them are a little bit more like that, particularly on bare wood, you know, like this kind of thing. You know, the lines sort of, they're not straight lines. You know, we've got a knot in the wood there or something. So again, a curved line, a simple pencil stroke, but built up in layers, and again, further processes applied to them. It's how you can create really nice, convincing textures. Sorry, I was going out the frame there, wasn't I? Sorry about that. Now again, this line doesn't have to be a consistent line. It can end up as a broken line as well. And this is a really, really useful pencil stroke because it applies to both the curved line and the jagged line. If we take the jagged line, for example, and we start to leave little gaps in there, so we've got little bits of paper showing in between. This, I always feel that this one represents more of the texture of pine trees and evergreens and Scots pines, that kind of thing. So it's a jagged line, but with little gaps in between. It's a broken jagged line, if you like. Again, if we draw the edge of the tree in there, it'll kind of make more sense. And again, they can overlap, and you can space them apart as much as you want. And you can kind of overlap them until they almost become a solid mass. And you can keep them a lot finer as well if you use you know, mechanical pencils and things like that. You get a lot nicer effect with a finer lead. I'm just doing this nice and dark and big and bold so you can actually see clearly, you know, the intended texture that I'm going for here. And again, we can just shade one side of this as if it's in shadow there. And just taper it out a little bit there. And again, soften it back with the blender if you want to. You're starting to, you know, you're now starting to get sort of pine tree textures there. Well, I think so anyway. I mean that's exactly what I would do, something like that. So there's a few pencil strokes just based around a line. Simple as that. Well, they're all, like I say, they're all based around a line. Now we can take this one step further as well, and well, if we look at the, I mean, we're looking at this as vertical lines, aren't we? If we turn this horizontal like that, it starts to take on a whole new meaning, because we can start to now, I mean, if we look at this and say it's, I mean, there's a foreground wave there, and these are all waves running off into the distance of a seascape drawing or something. It's the same kind of thing. It's almost like Morse code. Dot, dot, dash, dot, dot, dash. We're not curving and we're not making the line jagged, but we're just doing like a Morse code kind of pencil stroke. Again, that's a lovely one for building up delicate textures, distant waves on oceans and things like that. They gradually get bigger and more spaced apart the further forward you come into the picture. And again, works best over the top of graphite or with a layer of graphite on top, just to tone them down, and then going back in again with an eraser, you know, to create the white waves. I mean, don't judge this as a seascape drawing at all. That's just the process that I'd use, and the technique I'd use, the pencil strokes I'd use there to create that type of effect. And again, when we turn it that way on, we can soon turn that again back into, you know, a tree texture, can't we, of some description if we want to. So it's these same repetitive pencil strokes which are used throughout drawings to create different effects in different ways, but it's virtually the same pencil stroke, just based around a line. Broken line, curved line, jagged line, vertical line, horizontal line. Keeping those lines closer together, keeping them spaced out further apart, laying them down on top of graphite, laying graphite on top of them, erasing a little bit, and all those options you've got there to adjust any of these pencil strokes. Now, another one I want to show you is if we want a solid blocking of graphite. Now that's easy to do if we've got a small area, let's say like that, side of a building, a window or something. We can just literally put our pencil on the paper and move it up and down in this direction. It's almost like hatching, but without taking the pencil off of the paper at all. The pencil doesn't leave the paper. Now this is okay for shading in small areas all in one go. I can see what's happening. I must just explain as well, I'm working on a piece of cardboard. I'm going to pick up a little bit of texture from that, but if you're working on, you know, nice drawing paper on a smooth board, you wouldn't see quite so much texture. This is just something I rip off the back of the sketchbooks, the A4 sketchbooks that I use. I find them very useful to keep them when I've finished the sketchbook. I can clip reference photos to that and have them in front of me standing up, or just use them for this kind of thing. They're also useful for templates as well. I use this to cut down A3 sheets of paper. I just put that exactly on one half, draw a line down, and then run the knife across there, and it's a perfect A4. I do the same with A5 as well. The A5 cardboard from sketchbooks, I save those for cutting down A4 sheets of paper. I just plonk that on there and just cut it. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent, but that's another little tip for you there. Okay, so that's all well and good. You know, we've got a fairly flat area there. But now you imagine if we had actually had an area that was maybe this big, and we couldn't, it felt uncomfortable to do this pencil stroke throughout the size of this area. You know, it gets difficult to kind of shade in large areas evenly sometimes. You know, that's about as big as I can go without having to sort of really, you know, move my shoulder and my whole body to get that pencil stroke, which starts to get really uncomfortable. So the trouble is with this, if we want to shade all of that area in, you'll see what happens now. We get these overlaps because no matter how careful we are, the graphite is going to overlap the previous layer, and you can see what's happening. Look, we're getting this build up along that line as the graphite's layering up. We're even getting a bit of a build up here on the stop-start part of the pencil stroke. So it's not ideal for creating flat, even layers of graphite, because we get this overlap effect every time we shade. You can see it there, look, each overlap is a darker tone. So that's not ideal unless we purposely want that in the drawing to create a certain texture or a certain look on something. For example, I've used this kind of, well, I use this technique quite a lot actually for things like maybe we've got some damp patches on a building or something. I'll try and avoid straight lines, and I'll make sort of patterns, stop-start patterns with the pencil, and then as I overlap them the next time, it gives you that sort of, well, that's actually quite smooth there, actually, isn't it? But it gives you that kind of overlap, and it can create, you know, the impression of damp on a wall or texture on anything. So again, it's not a right or a wrong thing to do by itself. You know, it's a wrong thing to do if you're looking for a flat shaded area, a large flat shaded area, because you will get this, you will get overlaps. But again, you might want them for certain things. So bear that in mind when you're using that pencil stroke. Now the way to avoid this, to actually get a really flat, even lay down of graphite, say we've got the same, roughly the same sort of area again to fill in, I'm going to use what's called a tapered stroke. There's two kinds of tapered strokes. There's the semi-tapered stroke and the full tapered stroke. Now I'm just going to have to explain exactly what this is. If I just draw that, that's the edge of our paper. Imagine we're now looking at the paper this way on, like that. And our pencil is pointing down on the paper like that, ready to draw. You know. Now the pencil movement and direction of the pencil that we use just here is that direction. Just simple side to side, left to right, or up and down, whether you're working vertically or horizontally, pencil motions. Okay. Now the tapered stroke is working in that oops, that wasn't very good. It's working in that direction. We're now using a sweeping motion on the paper, because what we're trying to avoid are the start points where we start, we shade, we stop, we get all of this dark edge building up on both sides on the start points. We always get a line. But if we taper the stroke, where we glide the pencil on to the paper and we glide it off again, we don't get start points. So the stroke should look like this. And a semi-taper is where we cut that arrow in half and we put the pencil on the paper and we just flick it off in one direction and taper the stroke up. So a semi-taper is going to look like that. We've got a start point and then we've got the taper on one end, where it tapers off to a nice thin light, well, it looks like grass, doesn't it? I often call it the grass stroke, actually. So that's the semi-taper and that's the taper, and I'll just show you how effective the full taper is in conjunction with a semi-taper, because when you're using the tapered stroke, it's hard to work to an edge and keep those pencil lines within that edge. So what you do, you work away from that edge a little bit. So we'll start just here, applying light pressure. I mean, what it looks like I'm doing is that, isn't it? You know, you probably watch my drawings sometimes and you think I'm doing that, when in actual fact, the pencil is barely leaving the paper, but I am actually doing this kind of pencil stroke. I am gliding the paper, the pencil on and off at both ends, but it sometimes looks like the pencil is not leaving the paper because I do it so quick and I keep the pencil so close to the paper. that it just looks like I'm doing that, when in fact I'm actually doing this technique here. And it does take a bit of practice to get used to. But can you see now, look, we're left with this very loose edge. So now, when we do this part of it, the second layer, doing the tapered stroke, try and keep the pencil pressure the same as well. Doing up the tapered pencil stroke into that area, it'll kind of knit together in a very even way, in a seamless way, without actually seeing any of the graphite overlaps like we've got here. Look at that, look, no overlap whatsoever. Perfectly, well, it's not perfect, but you know, there's no overlaps. It's nice, flat and even, basically. But we are left with this area just here, and if we start to try and do a tapered stroke in that, we're going to go over the line, and it's going to look a bit, you know, a bit scruffy. So this is where the semi-tapered stroke comes into play. Again, try and keep the same pencil pressure, or you will get darker areas. But we have a start point now, and that's that line. So we put the pencil on that line, and we flick away from that line and into the edge of the full tapered stroke. And what's going to happen? Well, it's obvious what's going to happen, isn't it? We're going to get the same effect what we've got just here. A seamless, almost seamless transition of graphite there. And then for real perfection, if you blend that in, again, this is going to show a bit of texture because it's on some cardboard that's not perfectly smooth. But if you blend that in, you know, you're going to end up with a very flat lay down of graphite. And I've gone a bit darker along this edge here, but I'm kind of talking in between and taking my pencil off and forgetting the exact pressure that I used in the first place. That's why it's very important to maintain a very even pencil pressure when you're doing the tapered stroke. But that's the way to get perfectly flat and even laydowns of graphite in large areas, nice and seamlessly. Now, the tapered stroke isn't confined to this method. The tapered stroke is very useful for doing fur, for doing hair, for doing grass, all of those kind of textures, but you just leave more space in between each stroke. And this is how you can build up layers of grass as well, another technique I use. Sometimes a lot of people, I do it as well in certain areas, but sometimes a lot of people get carried away with the semi-tapered stroke for building up layers of grass. But I think you can see, look, what's happening there. We're getting this same effect just here. We're getting overlaps building up within the texture, and we don't want that. We want this kind of thing, because we can get our dark shaded areas just by going a bit closer together, applying a bit more pressure on the pencil and that kind of thing. You know, it doesn't all have to look like one obvious area of pencil strokes. We can start to change the direction a little bit of them, and again in conjunction with, where is it, my eraser, we can really start to create some lovely grass, natural grass effects using the tapered stroke. And again, for where the grass finishes along the ground there, we'll use the semi-tapered stroke for that one. We've got a start point, and our stop point is a taper into the area of grass above it. So it's a very important pencil stroke, that one, and it's one that really does, well, not really does take some practice, but it's definitely worth practicing, let's say, so that you can actually do it quite quickly, and it almost looks like the pencil is not leaving the paper. It's just lifting off slightly at the end and then going straight back down again within a fraction of a second. Because you might be seeing artists shading in like this, and it looks like they're doing this technique when really they're doing this. And it's the same with me. You may have watched some of my videos and thought, how do you get that so smooth and flat, John? Well, that's the stroke that I use, that one there. Now, other pencil strokes that I use, again, they're based around this kind of technique, but they're used more on a horizontal level, you know, like we've done the sea and everything. Obviously, you know, we've got the Morse code technique, the dot dot dash dot 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 dash dash whatever, you know, just very random textures like that. Now if we're doing this, let me just lay down a little bit of graphite. I'll just use the blender quickly. There's not too much graphite left on that. But if we're working over the top of, let's say, an underdrawing of a landscape that we're working on, and we're working on an area of grass now, I'm going to change the grade of pencil, and I'll use the B. It's still quite dark, but it's probably going to be light enough for what I want. And in fact, let me just bring the John Constable drawing in that I've been working on. I want to show you this area that I've been working on. You see this texture just here, look. I laid down some graphite first with a blender. I went in with some very light pencils, doing the technique that I'm going to show you now, and then I went over, I think it was with a B pencil, no, I think I actually went over that finally with an HB mechanical pencil, because it's actually darker than a B pencil. Just the way the lead's made, don't ask me, I know. Just with a slightly darker one. And this also involves pencil strokes where we're being more conscious of the tone as well. Like for example in this area here, we want some pencil strokes down there, but we don't want to start going like this to create grass. The transition between the light and dark is just too much, it's just too heavy. And we're not looking for big grass strokes like this either. We just want a very sort of almost cut grass or short grass look to the area. I tend to fall back on these kind of methods, but I start to sometimes use little zigzags and little ovals. Very exaggerated. What I do is that I'll hold that a bit closer so you can see. I mean, that looks awful on its own. And the other one I use is this, which is more little circles and ovals, okay? And I'll use that very delicately, little circles now, creating this kind of effect. So I'm using them in lines, like a pencil stroke, if you like. I'm still using them in lines, leaving little gaps in between. And it gradually starts to build up the textures in grass, or again on tree bark or on clothes or on buildings, on any texture you like where this would work. All of the textures and the line, like I say, everything's based around the line. It's just an adaptation of a line. That's all it is. Very simplistic way of thinking about it, but that's really all it is. Even though I'm working in little circles, those circles are formed from a line. And I'm working in a linear motion to slowly build up this texture. Now when I get closer into the foreground, I might want a little bit more texture there, so I might go to slightly more zigzagged texture to get more of a, not an individual blade of grass look, but more of a foreground grass texture, let's say. And I'll make those zigzags a little bit smaller, and they kind of transition from this to that, if you like, from circles to zigzags, depending on the perspective, how far away they are, how close they are. Like for example, here's a really good example in this one here. I'll show you how to do this now. Like I've just spoke about this area here. Now this area here was a different texture. You can actually see I've made it look completely different to that area there. And that's a really good case in point, because that's used both of these little circles and ovals and the little zigzags. When I say little zigzags, they can be little hatching marks, they can be zigzag joints up together, it doesn't matter. It's just this very small vertical texture that I'm looking for. And that's what I've done in that little triangular area there in the front. This bit here, I'll draw this bit for you now, and you'll be able to compare the difference. Put that back with the two. So if that was that triangular part there, what I actually started to do with this was fill this in with little zigzags. and create this sort of effect where I get overlaps. So the zigzags are overlapping, and that's giving me some texture to start with. It's a little bit small actually, and it's not very easy to do on printer paper. Now if I do the circular method right next to it, hold that close for you, you can see the subtle difference there in texture. Now that looks very crude, I know it does, but remember this was tapped over, it was gone over the top of a layer of graphite in the first place, and then I've reworked back into that area again to get a few darker tones. I've even gone in with the eraser on top to create little highlights, and then when I've gone over that with a brush, that's the texture. That's how I got the texture in the Constable drawing there. So again, it's a pencil stroke that's worth getting used to. You know, working in these small little circles, and then working in these little kind of flicky zigzag type pencil strokes and overlapping them works really great for very small compact textures, you know, like in these foreground grass areas and things like that. Now that texture there, the sort of oval one, the linear one, I mean that's basically squiggleism. That's the one that I use all the time to get the foliage, and there's so many variations on squiggleism. I think I could write a book on it by itself. You know, we can use this over a layer of graphite, or as you've seen me do with the Constable drawing, a very crude sort of big underdrawing layer. Again, it's squiggleism, it's scribbling to get that kind of scribbled texture like that. And then again, we can work over the top of that with a finer pencil and get more detailed textures in there. But the pencil stroke itself is the same. It's this. Figures of eights, little circles, overlapping. Scribble. Absolute scribble. There's nothing more to it, seriously. Other than the many adjustments you can do to it. The principle stays the same, it really is that simple, but you can do it tighter together till it almost becomes a solid mass. And like I say, you can space it out, make the lines and the circles a little bit bigger, have more of an open texture there, make it lighter, make it darker, make the line thinner and sharper looking, you know, with a mechanical pencil or something. These are the techniques that ink artists use as well for creating texture, foliage textures. Imagine if that was an ink pen. That's, you know, exactly how I'd be working with an ink pen to create those kind of foliage textures like that. So it's basically just, well, it's been nicknamed squiggleism because that's all it is. It's little squiggles, little squiggly lines, little circular lines. But you can kind of control that, you know, to create many different textures from that one pencil stroke, basically the scribble pencil stroke. And the final one that I'll show you, there are many more than this, many more than this, but these are just the most common ones that I use in my landscape drawings. Like I said, I don't really use those for their intended purposes, let's say, of shading areas in. I don't really use them at all. The final one is an obvious one, and I love this one because this works in conjunction with all of these techniques that we've used here today, every single one of them, and that's the simple dot stippling. Let me get a darker, in fact I'll use this one, it's quite a big dot. No, it's not. I want a darker pencil. Where are we? Where's my 6B? There it is. Just the simple basic dot. Again, loads of variations on this. You just stipple with a pencil, and again it looks lovely over the top certain areas, and you can concentrate these dots in closer together to create tone within the dots. I mean, eventually you're going to get a solid mass, so you must kind of stop. Well, you don't have to stop, you might want a solid mass there, but you're probably best just to shade it if you do. But just to keep going like this, you know, you're going to get darker, denser areas building up, tapering them out into light areas, more spaced out dots. Same with the squigglism, you know, tighter, closer together for your darker areas, more spaced out and looser for the lighter areas. And then right on the edges of your branches, I use this. A few little dots, pull those dots into the squigglism a little bit, pull them out across the edges. You get really natural looking edges to trees all through dots. It's actually called pointillism, is the correct word for it. And that's one I love to use, like I say, with squigglism, foliage techniques. Take some time to build these areas up, but boy do they look good when you take the time and work in layers like that. They really do look good. But you know, nothing looks good on this piece of paper. It's just a very quick demonstration. I mean, to make these all of these techniques and pencil strokes work, you know, you've got to spend time on them and use them in the right place on your drawings, obviously. And like I say, they always work better in conjunction with other techniques, whether it be blending, whether it be erasing, whether it be using them on or above and under drawing. You know, because sometimes in their own right they look a bit stark and a bit too obvious looking, don't they, like things like that, but you can see the difference there. That's another good one as well to use with an ink pen. You know, instead of using cross hatching to create shade, you can kind of use these kind of tapered dots, taper them out. Getting lighter, more spaced apart, showing the light area underneath. It takes a long time. I mean, I haven't got time to kind of get a really nice effect with it now, but you can see the kind of thing, look how that's tapering out into a lighter area, gradually getting darker as the dots get closer together. It just gives that impression when you do that. So there we go. Very, very simple. I mean, the more you think about it, it's such a simplistic way of looking at very complicated textures. And like I always say throughout a lot of my videos, you know, it's just a step-by-step thing, it's just baby steps. And each one of these pencil strokes is one of the baby steps, if you like. It's a starting point for working on top of, or it's a finishing point when you're working on top of something else with it. You know, it's just another step, it's just another brick in the wall, if you like. I'm sorry to quote Pink Floyd, but that's all it is. It's just another building block to your drawings. But they're absolutely, vitally important to create the right look to your textures. Thinking about the pencil strokes that you're actually using, and not just thinking, right, I've got to shade that area in dark there, like this. Oh dear, I'm getting these horrible overlaps. You know, a little bit more thought and you can avoid all of this stuff, and a little bit more experience with things like tapered strokes. You can get nice flat shaded areas as well by using, funnily enough, the squigglism technique and working in ovals. I'm running out of paper here. You will get a little bit of texture with it, but if you keep this nice and random, you know, working in ovals like this, overlapping ovals, you can eventually get very nice flat even laydowns of graphite, even on these hard edges and overlaps. You know, it's mainly done by just layering and overlapping. I am seeing some darker spots appearing there. It's like I say, it's not perfect. You don't get everything perfect this way. You will see a little bit of texture doing it this way. And again, that could be a good thing. I mean, I'm picking up texture here off the cardboard. I can see it coming through. But you can actually get quite a nice flat even lay down like that. And then obviously, you know, with a blender, we can blend any pencil marks and overlaps out quite well. You can on this as well, you can blend them out sometimes, but sometimes they just stay and you can always see them there, look. You can still see those overlaps there. Not as harsh as that one, but they're still there. Okay, so there's a few simple pencil strokes to get you going on your way there. Another tip as well, it's worth not diving straight into a drawing with these pencil strokes. It's worth getting a bit of printer paper, practicing them first, and then maybe get your sketchbook, dedicate a couple of pages to this, maybe draw some squares down or some circles down or something like that, and fill them in with some of the textures. Oops, I'm out of the frame. With some of the textures that you've seen in this video today. You know, and you can write underneath. We'll just draw a bit of a texture there. We can write underneath, you know, what each one is. You can write, you know, the jagged line, good for bark textures, you know, any other textures that you think it's going to be good for. You can write that down and store it in your sketchbook, and it's always there for reference for you then. When you're thinking, how do I get such and such a texture? I know, I'll have a look in my sketchbook and see all the textures that I've swatched out and made notes on. And it's always there for you as a reference. You know, it's always going to be helpful. So like I say, I know many textures, pencil strokes and things like that, but these are the very most common ones that I use on a regular basis all the time. And these are the ones that get me my results, if you like. So there we go. I hope that was helpful to you. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.